Hi, I'm Chinlu.
And I'm Sal, and this is our next make.
The weather's getting warmer, and it's time for cookouts and backyard games.
So this week we thought we'd make our version of a ring and hook game with a few twists.
Before cutting any wood or doing any modeling, we started our design process gathering ideas on a 3D whiteboard. We searched and gathered ideas of backyard games that we could make. As we discussed each option, we quickly narrowed down our options with some key requirements. We needed a game that didn't have too many pieces, was easily collapsible for storage, and transportable for bringing to various events. Once we settled on the hook and ring game, we started to gather details to help with the design and sketch down ideas on how to improve on the details. This 3D whiteboard continued on as our idea capturing tool as we prepared for our make.
For this project, I took a trip to my nearby lumber yard and picked up this beautiful piece of white oak. With a little bit of protective finish, it's a great choice for an outdoor project like this. To get started, I'm going to take this over to the miter saw and cut it down to rough lengths. This is typically the first thing I do when I start a project, because it helps me organize the pieces, and the smaller lengths are much easier to work with. Now I can start ripping the parts to their final widths. This project only has 6 wooden parts, so cutting them to size goes very quickly. This is the model I made in X-Design. It's actually quite simple. There's one large backboard, flanked by 2 narrow stiffening rails, a pivoting arm made of a horizontal and a vertical piece, and a gusset that holds the arm in place. When the gusset is pivoted upwards, the whole game can collapse into a nice small package. I got a little fancy with the vertical piece of the arm and added this step detail just for visual interest, so I took my time and laid things out by hand. In fact, I drew 2 parts in this board so I could build a second game. At the bandsaw, I quickly split the piece in 2 by navigating the blade through the waste material between them. Then I headed over to the table saw to make all of the long straight cuts. I first raised the blade as high as it will go, and then transferred a mark of the blade's leading edge to my rip fence. This will let me know where to stop cutting. I carefully push the piece into the blade and stop when the mark on my board meets the mark I made on the fence. And I must stress the word carefully here. With this technique, there's way more blade exposed than you typically want. If you're not comfortable with this cut, consider another approach. In fact, you could safely make all of these cuts with a jigsaw, like I'm doing here to cut the 45-degree details and to finish up the table saw cut. I used the same approach to cut the slot on the gusset. This time though, I made my first cut just a bit offset from the center, and then flipped the board and cut it again. This will ensure that the slot stays centered. I just keep nudging the fence over a bit each time to creep up on the perfect fit. The backer board has a slot at the top to receive the pivoting arm. After laying out the details, I drilled a few pilot holes at the drill press. Then I cut the slot and 2 side reliefs using the jigsaw. All that was left was to cut the pieces to their final lengths. The backer board and the top of the arm only needed a simple straight cut, and the stiffening rails needed a simple miter cut, but the gusset needed a miter and a straight cut to create this chamfered detail.
To prep for assembly, Sal sanded everything with 150 grit and eased over all the sharp edges. He also took a minute to drill a few counter bores for the magnets we'll use to mount this to metal posts. If you're mounting this to a wooden structure, you could drill clearance holes for wood screws instead. Then we glued up the backer board and the pivot arm. We tried to add the perfect amount of glue, but there was of course a bit of squeeze out. So we wiped it off with a wet cloth before it could set up. With everything in clamps, we also took this time to epoxy in the magnets. Sal would put a bit in each hole, and I would seat the magnet.
While things dried, I focused on how we were going to hold up the gusset. I knew I wanted to 3D print something that could lock it in place, so I modeled my first idea in X-Design. In one position, the gusset would be locked in place, but when rotated 180 degrees, it could pivot past the lock. The mounting plate has 2 fingers that interact with these notches. When you turn the knob, the fingers deflect and then lock the knob in a new position. My gut said that this design would work, but feeling it in action tells me that it's way over-designed. So I went back into SOLIDWORKS and designed a much smaller one. I also moved everything inbound of the knob and eliminated one of the fingers. This design is much nicer, but it still doesn't work the way I need it to. The finger is still way too stiff and it will eventually break. So I went back into SOLIDWORKS to refine my idea. I used the built-in data management tools to quickly create several revisions until I got things right. The first thing I did was turn the straight finger into an arc. That way, it only had to deflect a tiny bit when it went over each bump. This worked really well, but resulted in a different feel in each direction. One way felt smooth, but the other was more stiff. That's because in this direction, the finger gets pushed before it flexes. So I refined the design one more time. I added a second finger in the opposite direction and changed the shape at the end so it would only resist in one direction. This created the perfect balance. With all of the mechanics worked out, I could start to focus on other details, like the shape of the knob, how it interfaced with the gusset, and how I could also use it to keep score. I could also transform these raw prints into painted parts. I sprayed on 1 coat of primer and then 1 coat of matte black. To make the scoreboard stand out a bit, I used a paint marker to add a few highlights.
Anticipating that we may use this game for different occasions, we wanted to create a styling system that has the potential of swapping out design themes. So we came up with the idea of applying vinyl decals to a clear acrylic plate that can be slid in and out of the main body of the game. For detailed art that is cut out of vinyl, it is important to ensure that the thin details are still thick enough so that they don't get torn out during the weeding process. Weeding is the process of picking out the small pieces of negative space between the details of your artwork. Using this sharp pointed tool does the trick. A tip for a clean release of backer paper and transfer paper is to keep the side with the vinyl decal flat on the table while peeling at a slight angle to the artwork and pulling at a sharp 180-degree tilt away from the tear. Constantly checking for small corners that may lift and keep them down as you pull. Once properly applied, the plate is ready to be added to the final assembly when the time comes.
To give the wood some added protection, I applied a coat of boiled linseed oil. You just wipe on a thick coat, let it soak into the wood for about 10 minutes, and then wipe off the excess. It's a great finish for an outdoor white oak project like this. Assembly was pretty straightforward. I first cut a few 1/8-inch steel rods to length, and then drilled holes in the backboard, the pivot arm, and the gussets. I drilled the holes in the pivot arm slightly oversized so it could move freely. The other holes were drilled slightly undersized so they'd stay put when I hammered them in. Mounting the gusset lock and the scoreboard was just a matter of pre-drilling and driving in some screws, but we did have to take care to get things in the right position. We referenced the location of the gusset to position the lock, and then used our replaceable acrylic insert to position the scoreboard. All that was left was to set it up and have some fun.
We're so happy with how this turned out. We can't wait to use it all summer long at our house, as well as at a few events at the Dassault System headquarters.
Yeah, we're really excited about Iron Swug. It's an amazing event for SOLIDWORKS users. Be sure to check out the link in the description below to learn more about it.
And we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you were inspired to make a backyard game of your own, please tell us about it in the comments. And until then, we'll see you on our next make.